Maybe there's a memory you've never been able to forget. It doesn't matter how much time has passed. She keeps coming back. Sometimes in the silence of the night. Sometimes when you walk into the house and for a second, it feels like something should still be there. Maybe it's that image, the last moment, the last look. Maybe you remember exactly where he was lying. Maybe the room was too quiet. Maybe you walked over, sat next to him, and he slowly looked up. That look. Anyone who has ever had a dog knows. There are looks that seem to understand everything. But this one felt different. Like there was something there that you couldn't explain. Maybe you rubbed his head. Maybe you said something like, "It's okay. I'm here." And yet, something at that moment was engraved inside you, not as an ordinary souvenir, but as a question. Because many people who have lost their dogs say exactly the same thing, that in that last moment, something strange happened. Something silent. Something that felt deeper than just goodbye. Some say the dog looked directly into its owner's eyes, for much longer than usual. Others say he tried to get up even though he had no strength. Some say that he simply placed his head on his owner's hand, as if he was trying to memorize that touch. And after that, the silence. If you've been through this, maybe you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because losing a dog is never just losing an animal. It's losing a presence that walked through the house. It's losing the sound of paws on the floor. It's realizing that a place in the house is empty. But interestingly, for many people, what remains most memorable is not the moment he left. It's that moment before, that little second when he looked at you, as if he was trying to say something, and for a long time. Many people try to ignore this feeling. She tells herself it was just imagination, that it was just an ordinary look. But there is one question that keeps coming back, silently. What if that moment hadn't just been a goodbye? What if that look had a meaning that almost no one noticed at the time? After a dog leaves, something strange happens to the memory. It's not just the great moments that stay. In fact, what comes back most are the little things, such simple things that, at the time, seemed completely normal. For example, maybe you can still remember the sound of his paws walking around the house. That specific sound, sometimes quickly when he got excited, sometimes slow, when he was drowsy and came looking for a place to lie down. It's curious how this sound is recorded inside us, because after he leaves, the house is silent in a different way. It's not just silence, it is a silence that seems to have an empty space within it. And perhaps you will also remember something else. He followed you around the house, even when you didn't realize it. You got up to go to the kitchen, and a few seconds later, there he was. You changed rooms, and he appeared again. Not because I needed something, but because for a dog, being close to his human is simply where he wants to be. And anyone who has experienced this type of bond knows. There are looks that seem to say more than words. Maybe you're remembering now, that silent look. When you were sad, when you had a difficult day, when he sat on the couch and he just stood there, watching, without doing anything, without asking for anything, just present, as if he understood something that no one else understood. Now think for a moment. When you remember the last day, was that look there? Many people only realize this later. Days, weeks, sometimes years later, that in that last moment, the dog seemed to look differently, calm down, deeper, almost as if it were watching its owner with special attention. There is a comment that appeared on this channel some time ago. One person wrote something that touched a lot of people. She said that on her dog's last day, something strange happened. He was already very weak. He barely moved. But when she entered the room, he raised his head, with difficulty, and he looked at her for a few seconds, without deviating. She said that at that moment, she felt something difficult to explain, as if that look was holding something, as if it were important. But at the time she didn't understand. She just put her hand on him, stood there, and tried to be strong. Only days later, when the house became silent, that memory started to come back, and the question appeared. Maybe you've already asked this question too, even if I never said it out loud. What if that last look wasn't just a reflection? What if that moment was, in some way, conscious? If you've ever lost a dog, maybe there's a very specific memory coming back now. His position, the place of the house, the way that he breathed, or that silent moment when he looked at you. And maybe there's something you've never been able to decide. If that was just an ordinary moment, or if there was something there that you couldn't understand that day. But there is a curious reason why so many people keep exactly this kind of memory. Memory. Because for many dog owners, the last moment before departure never feels completely random. It seems intentional. And it is precisely here that many people begin to carry something heavy within themselves. A silent doubt. A feeling that maybe there was something at that moment that they should have understood better. And this feeling can stay with someone for years. Because what happens in that last moment, sometimes it continues to echo long after silence takes over the house. When people remember the last day with their dogs, there is almost always a detail that comes back first. It's not the exact moment he left. It's the environment, the house, the strangely silent atmosphere of that day. Maybe you remember how the house felt slower. The sounds seemed more distant. Even movements inside the house seemed to happen more carefully. Because when a dog is at the end of its life, humans start to walk slower, speak more quietly, sit closer. Maybe you remember exactly where he was lying. Many people say that the dog chooses a specific place on that last day. Sometimes it's the corner of the room, sometimes near the owner's bed, sometimes in that place where he used to sleep every day. That place in the house that today looks different. Maybe his plate was still there for a while. Perhaps the bed remained in the same place for weeks, because removing these things feels too definitive. And then there is breathing. Those who have been through this usually remember breathing. Slower, more spaced out. And at the same time, there was a strange feeling, as if the dog was still trying to stay there. Some people say that that day the dog was closer to its owner than the dog was, normal. Others say he seemed to be watching the house, as if he was looking at every corner carefully. And this leaves many tutors confused, because at that moment, no one is thinking about interpretations. The only thing that exists is the desire for that moment not to happen. Maybe you sat next to him. Maybe he held his paw. Maybe you repeated the same phrase several times. I am here. Everything is fine. I am here. But there is something that many people only discover later. And here, we need to talk about it honestly. What hurt most about that last day? It's not always goodbye. Sometimes it's the feeling that something is left ununderstood. This feeling appears days later, when the routine returns, when you walk into the house and automatically look at the place where it used to be sleep, when you realize that no one came to greet you at the door, when the sound of paws around the house just disappeared. It is at this moment that memory begins to reorganize itself. And some details come back more strongly. His look, the moment he tried to get up, the moment he laid his head on your hand, or that silent second where he just stared at you. There is a comment that appeared here on the channel that expresses exactly this. A man wrote that on his last day with his dog, something happened that he had never seen before, forgot. The dog was very weak, it barely moved. But when he sat down next to him, the dog slowly placed its head on his foot, and it stayed there, without moving. He said at that moment he thought it was just an attempt at comfort. But after the dog left, this memory started to bother me, because it felt like more than that. It seemed like a conscious gesture, as if the dog was trying to say something without words. And this leads many people to a thought they rarely share with others. Someone. Maybe you felt this too. A silent question that appears when you remember that day. Was he trying to say goodbye to me? Or worse, a doubt that weighs even more heavily on the hearts of many tutors. Should I have understood something at that moment? This kind of thinking can be heavy, because the love that exists between a human and their dog is simple, but it is deep, and when something ends without a clear explanation, the human mind tries to fill the empty spaces. That's why so many people relive that last moment over and over again. Replaying the scene, remembering every gesture, every look, every little detail, trying to figure out if there was something there that went unnoticed. If you've already done this, if you've mentally gone back to that last day more times than you'd like, then you are not alone. In fact, this is one of the most silent experiences and shared between people who deeply love their dogs. But there is something about that last moment that almost no one explains. Something that can completely change the way you see that memory. And to understand this, first we need to talk about something that many owners carry without realizing it. The silent guilt that is born after silence takes over the house. There's a part of grieving a dog that almost no one talks about. Because she doesn't appear in the photos, it doesn't appear in happy memories, and it almost never appears in conversations. She appears in the silence, after everything ends, after the house becomes quiet. After that, the routine continues. But something inside you doesn't seem to keep up. Many people believe that what hurts most is absence. But for many tutors, there is something even heavier. The guilt, a silent guilt, which appears when the mind returns repeatedly to that last day. Maybe you've already thought something like this. Should I have spent more time with him at that moment? Did I realize too late that he was getting worse? Did that look mean something I didn't understand? These thoughts may arise unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, while you are driving, or simply when you remember that moment when he last looked at you time. And the more the mind revisits that memory, the harder it seems to leave that moment in the past. Because emotionally, a part of you is still there. That day, in that place in the house, in that look. This happens because the bond that existed between you and your dog does not disappear when he leaves, but he needs to change his form. And when this transformation doesn't happen, the brain continues to try to resolve the loss. This is why many people feel as if something has become trapped inside them, as if a part of the love was still stuck in that last moment. And maybe you felt exactly that, as if time had moved on, but your heart was still trying to understand what happened. And here's something important that few people explain about grieving an animal. Time does not reorganize the bond. It just silences the pain on the outside. Inside, she remains active. It reappears when you view a photo, when you find an old toy, when you pass by the place where he used to sleep, or when you remember that last moment. If the guilt still appears, if the silence in the house still weighs heavily, it doesn't mean you're weak. It means that the bond that existed between you is still alive within you. And this is exactly where many people begin to understand something fundamental. That grieving a dog isn't just about learning to forget. It's about learning to transform the bond without erasing the love. And if at any point you've ever felt like you're carrying this pain alone, maybe I need to share something important with you. Because many people who go through this experience end up stuck in this cycle for years. Reliving the last moment, repeating the blame, trying to understand something that no one has ever taught how to process. That's exactly why I created a structured process to help people who, they loved their animals deeply. If guilt still wakes you up in the middle of the night, if the silence in the house still hurts, if you feel like a part of you was stuck that day, this is not weakness. This is a bond that has not been reorganized. Time does not reorganize grief. It just silences him on the outside. Inside, he remains active. And until this bond is reorganized, the pain repeats itself. That's why I developed a structured process based on attachment psychology and grief neuroscience to help you transform this loss without erasing the love. This process is called Eternal Bond Method. It was created to dissolve guilt, rearrange the void, understand the feeling of presence, transform love without feeling betrayal. If you feel like you've suffered too long, start now. Access is below. And in this first month, you can use the coupon, Layli. It's not to be forgotten, it's to transform. Now, before continuing, there is an important question, a question that many people avoid asking because it seems too difficult. But it can completely change the way you see that last moment. And if that look from your dog, wasn't it just a reflex? What if somehow he was trying to connect with you for the last time in a way that we humans almost never notice? Because there's something about the last moments between humans and their dogs, which starts to make a lot more sense when we look at this bond in a more different. And that is precisely what we are going to understand now. There is something curious that many people begin to realize only after losing a dog. They begin to revisit that last moment, but now with another type of attention. Don't stop, look for blame, but to understand what really happened there. Because when the initial pain subsides a little, some details start to make more sense. For example, many owners say that despite being very weak, the dog made an effort to look directly into the owner's eyes. Others say the dog tried to get closer, or he placed his head on the human's hand, or he just stood there, watching. Too long to be just a random gesture. This happens so often that it starts to raise a very serious question. Interesting. What if that last moment wasn't just the body reacting? What if it was a form of connection? Anyone who has lived with dogs for many years knows something that science is already beginning to understand. Recognize, too. Dogs are extremely sensitive to the emotional state of humans. They notice subtle changes in tone of voice, in breathing, in posture, in the silence. In many studies on the bond between humans and dogs, researchers have observed that levels of oxytocin, the hormone linked to attachment and connection, increase both in human and animal when the two maintain visual contact. This means that that look between you and your dog, it wasn't just a look, it was a real form of emotional communication. Now imagine this for a moment. If your dog has learned to connect with you throughout his life through his eyes, of the touch, of the presence, why would it be strange to think that, at that last moment, he was also trying to connect? Maybe not with words, but with what has always existed between you. The bond. There is a phrase that sums up something that many owners begin to understand after losing your dogs. A dog's last look is rarely about the end of life. It's about the bond he recognizes for the last time. Think about it calmly. For years, that animal walked around the house with you, waited for you at the door, followed you from one room to another, sat by your side when you were sad. He slept next to you, learned its smell, your voice, your mood. For a dog, a human is not just someone who takes care of it, it's the center of his world. So maybe that moment that remains etched in your memory, it wasn't just a biological farewell. Maybe it was something much simpler and much deeper, a recognition, one last connection, an instant in which the bond between you was completely present. There is another story that appeared in the comments on this channel. A woman said that when her dog was on the last day of his life, he was very quiet. But when she came closer and held his paw, he opened his eyes and stared at her for a few seconds. She said that at that moment, she felt a strange calm, as if the dog was calm, as if he wasn't scared. And years later, she wrote something that touched many people. She said, "Today I realized that that look didn't seem like a cry for help. It felt like a thank you. Maybe you've never thought of it that way. Because when we are living in the moment of loss, it is impossible to see everything clearly. There is fear, there is sadness, there is a desire for that not to be happening. But when the memory comes back, sometimes it brings something different. Not just pain, but meaning. If you now remember that last moment with your dog, maybe you notice something that previously went unnoticed. Maybe his look was calmer than you remember. Maybe he touched you. Maybe he simply remained there, by her side. And this raises a very deep question. Do dogs somehow understand something about the bond that we humans have? Does it take us much longer to understand? Because for a dog, love has never been complicated. He was never full of doubts. He was never full of guilt. For a dog, love has always been simple. Presence, proximity, belonging. And maybe that's exactly why the last moment between a human and his dog can carry something so powerful. Not because it explains everything, but because he reveals something that many people take years to accept. That the true bond between a human and their dog doesn't just end because his body is no longer there. Sometimes, that last look is not the end of the story. It's just the moment when the story changes shape. There is something that many people only realize long after the loss. In the beginning, everything seems silent. The house looks different. Habits change. The place where he slept looks strange. And sometimes pain appears at unexpected times, when you find an old toy, when you see a photo, or when, for a second, it seems like you can still hear the sound of paws around the house. But over time, some people begin to notice something curious. The dog's memory does not disappear. She changes. At first, remembering hurts. After a while, remembering starts to warm up. And this happens because the bond that existed between you and your dog was not created only on the physical plane. It was created through years of coexistence, routine, presence, of little things that happened every day. He knew when you were sad. I knew when you got home. He knew when you needed company. And perhaps that's why so many people report something that, at first glance, seems difficult to explain. Even after the dog leaves, the feeling of bond continues to exist, sometimes through a very vivid memory, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through moments when the memory seems more vivid than usual. Some people say that, in difficult moments in life, they remember exactly what dog expression, from his look, the calm he conveyed. And this memory brings a sense of real comfort, as if, somehow, the bond was still there. This does not mean that the dog has physically returned, but it means something very important about love. True love doesn't disappear. He transforms. It changes shape, but it continues to exist within the story you live together. Maybe that's why the last look between a dog and its human is so powerful. Because in that final moment, all the bond built over the years is present there. And when you look at that memory with less guilt, something starts to change. The memory is no longer just pain. It starts to become gratitude. Gratitude for all the days you walked together. Gratitude for all the simple moments that became eternal within our memory. And perhaps this is exactly what many dogs seem to teach us, even after leave. That love doesn't need to disappear for life to continue. He just needs to find a new way to exist. And if at any point you felt like the love you had for your dog got stuck in the pain, perhaps this is precisely why so many people are looking for a healthier way of reorganize this link. Because forgetting was never the solution. Transformation has always been. If guilt still wakes you up in the middle of the night, if the silence in the house still hurts, if you feel like a part of you was stuck that day, this is not weakness. This is a bond that has not been reorganized. Time does not reorganize grief. It just silences him on the outside. Inside, he remains active. And until this bond is reorganized, the pain repeats itself. That's why I developed a structured process based on attachment psychology and grief neuroscience to help you transform this loss without erasing the love. This process is called eternal bond method. It was created to dissolve guilt, rearrange the void, understand the feeling of presence, transform love without feeling betrayal. If you feel like you've suffered too long, start now. Access is below. And in this first month, you can use the coupon, Layli. It's not to be forgotten, it's to transform. Now there is just one thing that needs to be remembered. If that last look from your dog is etched in your memory, maybe it's not just because it was sad. Maybe it's because that moment carried something that the heart really recognizes, when the mind still doesn't understand. And there is a very special reason why this memory never disappears completely. Because some bonds, they were not meant to exist for just a single lifetime. Now go back for a moment to that memory that appeared at the beginning of this video. That moment. That place in the house. That moment when your dog looked up and looked at you. For a long time, perhaps that memory only seemed painful, a difficult memory, a scene that the mind revisits trying to understand if something was missing. If anything, it could have been different. But there is a possibility that many people only begin to realize much later. What if that moment hadn't been a mistake? What if that moment hadn't been a wasted moment? What if, in fact, that look had been the purest form of bond that existed between you? Because think calmly. Throughout your dog's life, how did he connect with you? It wasn't through words. It was through presence, proximity, the way he walked behind you around the house, the way he waited for you to arrive at the door, the way he looked when you were sad. A dog's love has never been complicated. He was always silent, direct, and completely sincere. Perhaps this is why the last moment between a human and their dog is often, it happens exactly the same way the entire relationship was built. Speechless. Just presence, just a look, and perhaps that moment that remains etched in your memory. Don't just be a farewell memory. Perhaps it is the memory of the truest bond you shared. There is something that many people realize over the years. The pain of loss changes. Badass, the feeling of connection does not disappear. Sometimes it appears when you remember a funny situation you experienced together. Sometimes it appears when you realize that certain habits of yours started because of him. Sometimes it appears when you simply close your eyes and remember the feeling of having him close by. This happens because some relationships do not exist only in time. They exist in the history they shaped within us. And dogs have a very particular way of doing this. They come into our lives in a simple way, but they leave deep marks. They accompany important moments. They see us grow. They see us cry. They see us change. And they remain there, loyal, gifts, until the last moment. Maybe that's why so many people hold that last look so tightly inside their hearts. Memory, because, in a way, it represents the entire story that you lived together. And here is a question that might be worth taking with you after this video. If the love that existed between you and your dog was real, if that bond changed your life, why would something so profound just disappear? Maybe that's why some memories never fail to warm the heart. Maybe that's why certain memories remain alive even after so many years. Because some bonds, they weren't just made to last while we're together. Some bonds seem to cross time. And if there's anything that last look was perhaps trying to say, maybe it was something very simple. Something that dogs have always known better than us. That when love is true, it was never just about the time we spent together. It was always about the bond that continues to exist even after the paths have parted, separate.